All right, well, welcome to this panel on this wonderful conference. Despite all the differences that we may see in political views and social views, I would hope that we could agree that competence is a good thing. And so I'm delighted that we have a chance to talk with this panel about this issue, because when you look across the world and you think about the state of democracy, we can talk about the state of institutions, the state of elections, the state of confidence of people in their democracies. But of course, very often what citizens of democracy want to know is, does it work? Can I actually get the social contract, the goods and services, the way of living my life in which government is supposed to be a partner? Does that work? And I always found in going around the world that this was often one of the hardest questions for young democracies, because when you have people who've just found their way to democracy, they suddenly realize, well, we elected those people and they should be doing a good job. But as it turns out, it's a problem for mature democracies as well, as citizens ask hard questions about whether their government can deliver. Earlier in the 20th century, we faced a technological transformation. Government had to change too. We reinvented the way we did manufacturing and education and healthcare and transportation and of course, waging war. We needed new kinds of public servants. We needed different kinds of disciplines to be a part of their training. We brought scientists into the government in large numbers to try to help lead the country through the technological and scientific revolution through which we were going. Well, today in the early 21st century, of course, we face a similar period in which the technologies, the frontiers of technology are challenging. They are challenging governments to keep up. One big difference, of course, is that the private sector is really very much in the lead in terms of these frontier technologies. And so what is the role of government? How can government both access these technologies and create circumstances for the continuation of innovation and forward progress? Government must change again, and there is really a question not just of the structures and the laws, the restrictions and the ways that government might support and amplify innovation, but it is also a question of who will do it. It's a question of the people who the government needs to make government work. And so for this panel, we have a great set of people to talk about, beyond party politics, about the kind of public servant that we need. I get to introduce the panel, all of whom I know. Frank Fukuyama has long been one of America's great political thinkers. Frank and I were also babies together at the Rand Corporation in the early 1980s when they hired us at the age of 11. Frank is the Nomolini Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute, and he trains public servants across the world. Scott Hooper is Director of the National Government, that means the U.S. government's, Office of Personnel Management since July of this year. He brings 30 years of management experience, but we know Scott mostly by the fact that he is a part of the Valley. He helped really to set up Andreessen Horowitz, one of the great venture capital firms and a firm that we all know well. Scott helped to build it from the ground floor up. Back when people wondered what an iPhone actually was, Scott was already at work. So we're grateful to have you back with us for this panel, Scott. And then Phil Zelikow. Phil Zelikow is a senior fellow here at the Hoover Institution, the Bota Chan senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Philip and I also served in government when we were babies back in the 90s. And Philip has served on any number of government panels and commissions and was a professor at the University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's University, when we recruited him to come to Mr. Stanford's institution instead. And so I'm delighted to have this great panel, and I'm going to ask each of them to just make a few brief comments. I'm going to start with Frank and then Scott and then Phil, and then we'll just have a conversation. Thank you.
I should point out that Condi and Phil Zelikow together exerted a lot of competence in helping to reunite Germany, keeping it in NATO, and producing a Europe whole and free. And those were the great old days when we had diplomats that could pull things like that off. So I'm going to get to the question of personnel and who should go into government eventually, but I actually want to back up and talk about the broader problem that this conference is trying to address, which is why is government competence in trouble right now? Why does it seem to be decreasing? And that gets you to the fundamental problem of what's wrong with the American bureaucracy today. So I think that the fundamental problem is in a way the opposite of the conservative diagnosis of government. Today, a lot of conservatives will say the problem with the bureaucracy, especially the federal bureaucracy, is that you have a bunch of unelected bureaucrats that are out of control. They're making laws, they have a liberal bias, and they're not under the control of their elected, of the people's elected representatives. I actually think that that's 180 degrees wrong. That the problem with the bureaucracy that we were talking about in the morning sessions is the exact opposite, that it is over-controlled, that there is too much political control over the behavior of bureaucrats, which puts them in the mindset of simple compliance rather than focusing on actual producing actual results. Where this comes from is complicated. We wanted to invite Nick Bagley to this conference, and he unfortunately had a conflict, but I'd point you to a piece that he wrote in the Michigan Law Review, I think back in 2019, where he said that, the problem is actually caused in many respects by progressives who believe that legitimacy comes from procedures. And they want to use government to do good things, but they think that legitimacy is increased by layering on more procedures, and in the end it prevents the bureaucracy from actually making decisions that concretely help people. And I think that that's a fundamentally correct diagnosis. Now, just to back up this idea that bureaucracy is over-controlled, there are basically four ways that political principles can control bureaucrats. So you can write ex-ante rules, you can have ex-post review, you have appointment power, and you have removal power. All of these, I think, can be used to excess. So in terms of ex-ante rules, something like the Federal Acquisitions Regulation is a good example. You have literally thousands of pages of detailed rules about how to buy an office desk or a computer that federal agencies have to abide by. You have, I think, in many ways, excessive ex-ante control. You have lots of hearings and a lot of litigation because people in this country love to sue the government. They love to sue the government for non-performance, for doing the wrong thing. And in many ways, part of the bureaucratic bloat of governments is in anticipation of future litigation. Somebody is going to sue you for doing the wrong thing. And that's why you generate mountains of rules. Like if you do an environmental impact statement, you're expecting that you're going to be sued by, several dozen stakeholders, and so you want to write the statement out in such language that you anticipate every single lawsuit that you will ever get. Appointment power is really the core of this topic, so we'll get to that. But removal power is also, I think, as I said, for some reason, the main route to improving bureaucratic performance of this particular administration. And I think there's a real problem there because, in fact, you want to limit the president's removal power because you want to protect expertise. You have to delegate authority to lower levels of the government that actually have the knowledge, the local awareness of what life is like on the front lines. And that's the reason why you actually create for-cause removal provisions that prevent the president, for example, from removing the governors of the Federal Reserve Board, right? Now, I think that if you think about the American political system in comparative perspective, you have this, one way of distinguishing between different political systems is in terms of what political scientists call veto points, right? How many parts of the government can actually stop something from happening? And I would say that there's a spectrum that has China at one end of the spectrum, where there's basically one veto point. That's Xi Jinping. And then I would say, I don't know, a little humorously, but I think the state of California is at the far other end of that spectrum. Just to give you and you can design different democratic systems with more or less veto points. Among modern democracies, America has more veto points than almost anyone else. We have an upper house that is very powerful. We have an independent judiciary that can overrule legislation. We have delegation to state and local governments. Many other democracies really do not have these kinds of provisions. In addition, we've added extra veto points. The filibuster rule is one that requires supermajorities to pass ordinary legislation. And then we have a lot of non-constitutional veto points. So Diego Zambrano has been writing about private right of action. In California, in the state of California, we have this law called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that was passed in 1971. It gives standing to all 40 million residents of California who can sue any project, public or private, anonymously with no statute of limitations. And one of the reasons that it's very hard to do things like build high-speed rail is that, every kilometer of track is being sued by somebody under this particular provision. And so I think that, in a way, all of the political scientists have really not done enough work in thinking through how you would actually redesign that system to make it still democratically accountable, to make sure that bureaucrats are actually acting within their mandates, but it can actually do things. I invented this term vetocracy in one of my earlier books to describe the American system as it had evolved. In the American system, we delegate veto rights and veto power. We do not delegate the ability to actually push things to a concrete decision that is good for citizens. And I think if you're thinking about how to deal with this bureaucratic bloat, excessive proceduralism, and so forth, you need to think of not just getting rid of individual, permitting rules that are obstructive. You need to think about the structure of the system as a whole. How do you reduce the number of political veto points? Because you can get rid of a whole bunch of permitting rules, but the system is just going to recreate them, in a matter of months or years, because of the, the structure of the way power is distributed. I'll just give you one example of how you can delegate power in a more effective way, and it actually doesn't have to be done by statute, and that's what the Army did in the wake of the Vietnam War. Army's performance in Vietnam had a lot to be desired, and the Army is actually a learning organization. They, under the Training and Doctrine Command and other authorities within the Army, they reviewed their performance. They changed the basic doctrine under which especially officers trained, adopting, it was actually a German concept called Auftragtaktik, which basically said that if you're a senior officer, you want to delegate the maximum amount of authority to the lowest possible command level, because they are the ones that really understand the tactical situation. It is the second lieutenant that's trying to assault the building, and not a general a couple hundred clicks back at headquarters that is going to know what the best thing to do is. And I would say that, the Army in that period in the 80s and 90s that led to the Gulf War in 91, the successful operations in both Gulf Wars actually had adopted this kind of decentralization of authority and the empowering of junior officers. They have a concept called freedom to fail. So there was a discussion in the earlier panel about innovation. You cannot get innovative behavior if you are going to punish people for taking risks. And one of the doctrines that the Army developed was your career does not end if you make a command decision that doesn't work out. That your superiors are going to look at the conditions that you were facing on the ground at that time, and if it seemed like a reasonable risk, they would, they would not hold that against you. They would not derail your career for that. And that is something in civilian agencies that is really, really hard to do. I think this was mentioned again in the earlier panel, that we don't empower people to take risks, we punish them for taking risks that go wrong. And so I'm just going to leave it there. I think that if you think that the need in the bureaucracy is actually to empower bureaucrats to use common sense, judgment, their long-standing collective experience, you cannot do this safely unless you have the right people in charge. You're not going to delegate lots of authority to people with very shallow educational backgrounds, resumes, and so forth. I'll just give you one example of that. You compare the TSA to the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve is full of people that have incredible experience in financial markets. They got PhDs in economics, extremely high levels of capacity, and we permit them to have incredible discretion. They can say, this bank we're going to save, this bank we're going to go bankrupt, right? The TSA deliberately was staffed with people with only high school educations, and you're not going to trust that kind of person to make a complex judgment about, does that person look like a terrorist? Are we going to inspect, their bags, make them take off their shoes? And instead, you just give them standard operating instructions. Everybody has to take off their shoes when they go through the TSA checkpoint. And the difference between that is really all about capacity. So if you're going to do the kind of reform that I think a lot of the people in this conference want, where you actually allow people in the bureaucracy to use judgment, they've got to have good judgment. They've got to be capable of doing that. And that means that you can't safely delegate that authority without also worrying about the personnel issue and the human capacity issue in your bureaucracy. Right, that's it, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I agree with a lot of what you just said, and so I'm going to try to add a few things. So, first of all, thank you for having me here today. I am obligated to tell you this because unless you've been hiding under a rock, you might know that the government is shut down right now. So I'm here in my personal capacity, not in my official capacity. So I just want to make sure, in case speaking of risk, if my own OIG is watching this, I'm just here as a U.S. citizen representing my thoughts here today. So I thought let me add a little bit to what Frank said. I would summarize everything from my perspective very around competency to say, I don't think we have a competency problem in terms of the people in government. I think we have a systems problem. And that systems problem is a lot of the issues that kind of Frank talked about. But let me kind of give you a couple. I'm going to run through at least what I believe are some of the key problems that I've seen that I think impact the behavior. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about which ones I think actually are potentially solvable and which ones I think we probably need much smarter people to go figure out. Let me start with one that's not obvious, but we have an age demographic problem in the US government. So 7% of our workforce is under the age of 30. And that compares with about 23% in the non-federal workforce. And on the same side, we have 44% of our population is over the age of 50, which compares with about a third in the general workforce population. So one of the things I know that Dr. Rice is very passionate about, which I agree with, is how do we get technology? How do we get innovation in the government? And it's not only that, young people are not the only people who can innovate and do technology, but we've got to kind of solve that problem. And I'm going to come back to in a minute how we solve that one. Secondly, I'll point out, I'll summarize in very crass terms, I think what Frank just said very eloquently, which is we have a risk problem in government. So I can tell you just in my first 3 months, everything I hear from my team is if we do that, our OIG might give us an audit letter, GAO might give us an audit letter, some congressional Democrat is going to haul me up in front of their committee, they're going to send me some nasty letter. There's this whole set of kind of urban legends around litigation. So I'll just give you a very simple example. We use a lot of paper in the government, as you might know. We send a lot of things out by paper. And the number one reason that I got why we could not stop using paper and instead using email was somebody might possibly sue us because they didn't actually see it, and we'd be, basically go to jail for this, which is never going to happen, and quite frankly, is not really a real risk. But we do have a real risk problem, and I'm going to talk about that one. The sum of the risk problem in my mind is exactly what Frank said, which is people want to take zero risk, and there's no concept of balancing risk minimization versus upside capture. So I come from the venture capital world, as Dr. Rice mentioned. We live in a complete opposite world where, quite frankly, we don't care at all about risk, and all we care about is the maximization of upside capture. Now, I'm not proposing we do that in government, but there is a happy medium here that I'll talk about in a minute. We have a performance management and accountability problem in government, and that also ties to a compensation problem. So I'll just give you an example on performance management. So every year, most agencies rank people 1 through 5 as part of their annual performance reviews, 5 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. Today in federal government, 70% of federal employees get ranked a 4 or a 5, which means they are above average. And 0.3% of people get ranked a 1 or a 2. In a population of 2+ million people, it's just not mathematically possible that we have that level of dispersion of opportunity. And as a result, when you tie that into compensation, what happens is all the compensation is basically peanut buttered out to people, essentially. So we have no differentiation in terms of kind of performance as it relates to compensation. Most people get a very small bonus that has very little incentive or kind of retentive value. It's a big issue that we have to deal with. Fifth problem I think we have is a speed and efficiency problem. So basically, at least my take is, historically in government, the more people you have, the bigger the budget you have. That's how you derive power in government. I did a little experiment when I was going through my Senate confirmation process, and I asked both Republicans and Democrats on my committee when I met with them one-on-one, do you think we could actually cut money from the federal government? And I will tell you to a T, everybody said you could take 10 to 15% out of the federal government spend and nothing would happen. Which made me very, very happy to hear that. Now, the problem is that will never actually happen because every single person in Congress is not motivated by what happens at the macro level. They're motivated by what happens at the micro level in their district. And so even though everyone agrees we actually spend too much money, unless we figure out this problem, which unfortunately is a very vexing problem, we will constantly have a spend and efficiency problem. And finally, I think we have a narrative problem in government. One of my first meetings, one of my career employees came up to me and said, you guys, and when she meant you guys, she was associating me with Doge. And she said, you guys are ruining everything for the federal government. I said, why is that? And she said, because what we've told people all along is the reason to come to the federal government is because you have lifetime employment. That's basically the messaging that they've been selling people for a long time. And I said to her, which she didn't like, I said, first of all, if somebody told you that, they're lying to you because there is no such thing as lifetime employment, unfortunately. And secondly, to me, that is a terrible narrative for how we actually attract people to government. So I'm going to, now that I've given you all the problems, let me talk about some of the things that I think we can fix and some of the things that we're trying to do at OPM. Number one, on the age demographic problem, we just have never done a very good job on recruiting efforts dedicated to early career people, and we're working on that very, very carefully now. Part of the problem is, I think, again, we've kind of created this false dichotomy in my mind, which is you have to, at 22 years old, decide, do you want to be a 40-year career federal government employee, or do you want to be a career private sector employee? In my mind, that's just a fallacy that we don't need to perpetuate anymore. And so we've got to find better ways to allow people to do small stints in government, go back and forth between private sector, and going to the narrative problem I mentioned. We have to change the narrative. So the narrative for me, for young people, for government, has got to be come to a place where you can work on incredibly hard, incredibly complex problems, incredibly high-skilled problems, be surrounded by smart people, be recognized for the work you do. And oh, by the way, if you decide you want to go in the private sector, we have to be able to demonstrate that the private sector values that experience by being willing ultimately to hire you and compensate you for that. On the incentive side, we may not ever solve fully the risk aversion problem, but what I've been kind of trying to tell my team is let's focus on taking managed risk. And what I mean by that is let's at least encapsulate what the risks of something are, and let's think about what the upside opportunity is. And exactly to Frank's point, we're not going to punish you for taking risks if you've done the work ahead of time, you at least understand it, and we all agree that it's something to do. And yes, if I get hauled in front of a congressional committee, like that's fine. I'm happy to kind of answer to those questions. I'll give you a very, very simple example. So we manage retirement services at OPM. So as you all know, because of the actions that have happened this year, we've had a larger number of people leaving the federal government than normal, many of whom are retiring. So the burden on our team in retirement services is very high. So one of the solutions to that problem is we want to make sure we have less dislocation from the time that somebody terminates from the government and gets their last paycheck and when they actually receive their first dollars on the retirement side. Traditionally, that could take 60, 90, sometimes 120 days to get somebody a retirement check. So I asked my team, I said, what about the thought experiment of can we do something called interim pay, basically, where we kind of very quickly kind of do a calculation, estimate what we think it is. Let's do some work to figure out how much we want to discount that a little bit. So today we discount it by 20%. But the idea is, can we get you a paycheck faster while we're actually figuring out what's the right long-term dollars to give you? And not surprisingly, the first response I got from the team was, we can never do that. It's crazy. It's too much risk. So we actually forced them to quantify the risk. It turns out that if we were 100% wrong with every single person we anticipate retiring this year, out of a $1.3 trillion trust fund that we manage for retirement, we might actually lose $1 million out of that trust fund. if it turns out we were 100% wrong with our early calculations on everybody. Now, in my mind, like, that is a perfectly rational risk to take, and I would be very happy to go talk to Congress about that, and they may disagree with me, but like, these are the kinds of things that we have to help people understand. Performance management and compensation, just so you know, we put out some guidance already on this, but one of the things that we are going to do is require forced distributions of rankings of employees in the federal government. So no longer will 70% of the people be ranked 4s and 5s. Today, actually, for senior executives, we've mandated that can be no more than 30%. Similarly, we want compensation to follow that. So we put out guidance that says we want 60% of kind of incentive compensation to tie to those top 30% of individuals. And so we're working on things like that. We're working on accountability, making more people, as close to at-will employees as we possibly can, looking at kind of, RIF-related regulations, other things that kind of, create challenges in terms of accountability. From an incentives perspective, the other thing we're trying to do is make sure that we can have performance that actually tracks real performance as opposed to proxies for performance. So almost every government job today has degree requirements that are in the job descriptions that don't really kind of don't distinguish between whether you might have been a Russian studies major in somewhere or you are applying for an engineering job and you have a computer science degree. We also have minimum tenure requirements that are required in order to get promoted into various job levels. These are really, kind of in my mind, crass proxies for performance that actually prohibit particularly early career people from being able to proceed and kind of move through the organization. And we want to eliminate a lot of those things. Finally, on the spend efficiency side, I think the best thing we can do there, which is going to be a problem, with Congress, but at least on our side, is we can create the right incentives to incent efficiency. So, as an example, in my organization, everybody's annual objectives now have efficiency as part of their annual objectives. And efficiency, in my mind, is can you deliver the same or better level of service, but do so at lower cost, whether that's through organizational changes, it's through technology changes. And so if we tie people's organizational performance and ultimately their rankings to the objectives that we want, I think there's ways for us to improve here. So I'm going to stop there because I know I don't want to kind of overwhelm the discussion, but thank you for your time, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks. The hypothesis of the conference is that American people have this image that the big issue of government is what should government do, and that we think that that's actually not been the big problem with government. The big problem with government is people don't think it does the stuff it's supposed to do very well. And that would then raise an issue of that we can divide into the barrels of capacity and competence. So, if I want to take an airplane flight, the capacity is the airplane, the competence is the trained pilot. You need both. Or if I use a computer metaphor, if I want to run a cool operating system, I need hardware and software. Hardware, these are the structures, the capacities that a government might have to do useful work. Actually, all the issues of laws and procedures and so forth, those are all hindrances that clog the sheer capacity to do useful work, even if your people were brilliant. Or they might not have money. So you do have to work the capacity side of the problem. As I put it earlier today, you can't run an iOS operating system on a 386 computer. But you also actually need the software. You need the competence side. And this is harder to examine. So let's just take a case study. Let's just suppose we had a natural experiment in which the officials basically had infinite money, extreme authority, all the scientific knowledge, the best scientific knowledge in the world, and see what's left. Well, actually, we ran that national experiment. It was called the COVID crisis. It was the largest crisis in the history of the United States since 1945. It's a crisis that in the United States hospitalized 7 million people in the first couple of years. It caused the premature deaths of about 1.2 million Americans. It cost the American government and discretionary fiscal policy in the neighborhood of $5 trillion to obtain that result. The United States spent more money on this problem than any country in the world by any measure. The relevant authorities, by the way, were enormous. Congress passed every law that was asked of it, and appropriated money hand over fist. So you had money, and we had the best science in the world, we had the best hospitals in the world. Actually, before the crisis, people ran studies basically saying, what's the capabilities for a public health crisis? The United States, top of the list, scored 83.5. You could compare that, say, to Spain. 83.5, Spain was 66. Italy was 66. In the crisis, the United States did far, far worse than any other developed area in the world in its performance. If you compare it to Europe as a whole, probably the difference in quality of performance amounted to 500,000 premature deaths in the United States that would have been prevented had our performance been as good as Europe. 500,000 deaths. So if you break it down, you do the age adjustments and other things. Let's say you compare Spain to Florida, which actually has about the same median age. Spain did 50% better than Florida in stopping premature deaths of its people in the COVID crisis. Italy did 30% better than Florida. Italy's median age is slightly higher. So this is a really interesting case to examine. This is a case, by the way, that is not a niche case or an obscure case to Americans. This, for every single family in the United States, formed judgments about government from being directly touched by its performance in this crisis. By the way, the partisan narratives about this crisis are mostly wrong. The Democratic narrative is to blame Trump and blame people who didn't follow the science. The Republican narrative is to blame China and blame pointy-headed elites. It turns out that's mostly wrong. I led the COVID crisis group, which would have been a national COVID commission had Republicans and Democrats decided they wanted a self-examination of what had gone wrong, which they did not. Not all in each party, but enough. And but we interviewed nearly 300 people involved in the crisis, many, many, many documents. I participated in almost all those interviews myself. The same question, by the way, in all those interviews came up again and again. Is the United States still a country that's capable of solving big problems? The lessons from the COVID war were not mainly about following the science. Operational challenges were at the forefront. Not science, not money. The biggest challenges were to know what to do and be able to do them. It was really know how to do what needed to be done. There are three main cultures in governance. These cultures don't necessarily talk to each other very much. One culture is a culture of programs and process. People get authority and money for a program. Usually the way this works is interest groups spotlight a problem. People get authority and money to spend money on the program and address the problem. The programs are created to dispense money, and they do that following the given process. The programs are often run by lawyers who ensure that the money is being distributed in compliance with the processes. It's a culture of compliance, run by lawyers. Another is a culture of research and investigation. Research and investigation. This is the dominant culture of high science. It's the realm of basic research, some ethical reflection. Its strengths were apparent in the COVID crisis, for example, in the understanding of molecular biology and the National Institute of Health's support for messenger RNA technology. The Center for Disease Control nurtures cadres of disease detectives. However, research culture can also be insular and can also seem alien to ordinary people's daily realities and practical problems. Those disease detectives actually had no idea how to run large operations in a crisis. And by the way, had no operational authority to run them. All the operational authority were in state and local governments. The third culture is a culture of operations. This is a culture to produce results. It is a culture that can be resilient and adaptable, since the operators actually have to adjust to the real conditions they encounter. You know, they actually, if the machine doesn't pick up the garbage can, they have to fix the machine. This is a culture that also can become insular and clannish in other ways. It is the dominant culture in most private firms, especially the firms that either make products or deliver services. The COVID war revealed a collective national incompetence in governance in the United States. Contrary to many media stories, the federal government had no real playbook for how to contain the pandemic. I've actually read the supposed playbook that the Obama administration is supposed to have left to the Trump administration. The playbook was a diagnostic manual for what questions to ask yourself in order to figure out what procedures and processes you would then invoke. There are actually no plays diagrammed in the playbook at all as to what to do if there was a pandemic. So, for example, the government did not it had programs. It did not have preparedness. For example, many of you may remember the business about right at the beginning of the crisis, tests. We need tests to see if people have COVID. So we needed, in very short order, millions and millions of tests. They produced them, by the way, very well and very quickly in South Korea or in Germany by partnering with private industry. We had no readiness to partner with private industry to make tests and had no industry to make our tests scale, even if CDC had designed their tests correctly. Even if we had the tests, however, even if we had 1 million, 3 million, 5 million tests stockpiled in the warehouse within a few weeks, we had no strategy for how we would use such tests. For example, do you use the test to do biomedical surveillance to see the progress of the disease? Do you use the test to do screening so you can figure out how to let people go to work or let people go to school? Do you use the test for diagnosis to determine how or whether they should be treated? It turns out those 3 different purposes have 3 different kinds of tests with different time elements involved and how long it takes to get the results, what you do with the results, what level of quality you need. We had no strategy for how to use the tests, even if we had them. And then when we did start developing strategies, we didn't have any plan for how to bring the Food and Drug Administration on board with the strategy we had. That's just one illustration among several. No one in the federal government really knew who was in charge of orchestrating the response, by the way. To this day, the basic confusion about crisis authority, there was a ton of authority, but the confusion about where that authority was and who should wield it, roles and missions, including the proper role of the CDC, has never really been addressed to this day. By April and May of 2020, federal crisis management simply collapsed. The local authorities thought that the restrictions on where people could go and schools, which they put in place, they thought those restrictions were only going to last for a few weeks. No one had a plan for what to do next after those weeks. The authorities, in turn, were flying blind because they could not track the outbreak's progress until patients started showing up in the ERs. As these failures and tensions became apparent, they fed a toxic politics that further divided the country into the crisis rather than bringing it together. It turns out, you heard all the red and blue rhetoric in the crisis. When you look at it closely, red and blue states actually adopted surprisingly similar approaches on the ground in what to close and what to reopen. It just didn't sound that way in the rhetoric. Practical tools to reopen schools and reopen businesses could have been deployed much sooner. Incidentally, it's interesting to notice, the United States kept its schools closed about twice as long as they kept their schools closed all over Europe. So it's not a liberal conservative point at all. It's not like, Europeans didn't follow science and we did. They figured out how to reopen the schools, we didn't. Most communities just didn't have the know-how for, how would we go about reopening the schools? There were Americans all over the place trying to improvise and figure out how to do it, but you couldn't get that worked into the people who had the authority. So most communities just didn't have practical guidance about how they could use the tools they had. Meanwhile, the CDC was misjudging how the virus was transmitted. And that was a problem in which one set of elites was actually disregarding another set of elites, the elites who did biology using tuberculosis models from the 1920s, which were out of date and irrelevant to this, were not listening to the people who did occupational safety and health work with aerosols, mostly from more blue-collar universities, who actually knew a lot about how you could adjust these sorts of problems, but they weren't listened to. That was a elite-on-elite problem, not the problem that elites were all pointy-headed. So, our leaders are now, as the pandemic goes into the memory hole with no serious self-examination, you can treat it like it's an inescapable tragedy. It was as if 100 years ago, accepting that life brings fires and floods, it never occurred to anyone that there could be such a thing as building codes or levies. So what we need to learn from this crisis is how to meld those three cultures of governance in practice. What the COVID war exposed, what every recent crisis has exposed, even in Iraq and Afghanistan, is the erosion of operational competence in much of American civilian governance. Look, for example, at how often governments and agencies had to hire management consultancies, McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, Bain & Company, and a number of others, to perform basic operational tasks. It was telling how often such firms were asked to do the work itself, to staff leading officials and organize the management of the crisis. It is one thing to hire contractors to take on specific time-limited tasks. It is another to just outsource to contractors the policy design work itself. That is the point at which the government simply outsources the know-how of governance. And by the way, the consultants didn't always know what to do either. On the high side, what you saw, though, is among the American people were often terrific. They were fighting a system that made failure easy and success hard. They were improvising all over the place. Operation Warp Speed is a famous example of this. By the way, it didn't score its main success in vaccine development. It actually, in a kind of natural experiment, in its mRNA vaccine development, Pfizer, by the way, did not even need or use Operation Warp Speed. Warp Speed was a belated initiative that was improvised by career bureaucrats, outside experts, and administration gadflies. It scored mainly because it helped to manufacture the vaccines, eventually even at Pfizer. It sustained competition. It hedged across a whole portfolio, so the world was not just betting on unproven mRNA technology. It set up a strong plan for national distribution through America's drugstores. It was an improvisation staffed from the Pentagon, thanks in part to General Milley, the private sector, and gifted career officials. It showed that the American potential was still there. So what I want to close with then is to step back and at least use this crisis as a learning experience. A lot of people think that there is this divide between the world of policy and implementation, or policy and administration. Policy is the high-minded work of people who say what to do. Implementation, administration, is the work of how to do it. It's the job left to the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. My view is actually anyone who doesn't think about the how isn't doing policy. And that's, in a way, the lesson we need to take away, is we need to expand our definition of policy to be sure that we can demand competence from our public officials and the people beneath them who have to figure out how to do things, not just what the goals should be. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for those great interventions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of you a question to follow up, and very briefly, and then we'll open up for maybe 15 minutes or so from the audience. So let me start with you, Frank. You made an impassioned plea for the expertise that one finds within the bureaucracy. I certainly found that when I led the State Department and the Foreign Service. But there is another part that says, but if you want to reform, you don't want to be dependent on people who've just been in the old system. And I will say that I often found at the State Department that it was hard to get people to think differently. So how do you square the idea that you want the kind of deep expertise, the people who've been there, the people who've seen it, with the tendency of the people who've seen it to say, well, that's not the way we've always done it. So how do you think about that problem?
Well, there's no single way to manage that. I think that a lot of times fundamental disruption is actually a good thing because sometimes rather than just piecemeal reform, you got to really rebuild the building from the foundation up. We were talking about this in our private session this morning, but in my view, actually, the kind of destructive work that the current administration has been doing to the bureaucracy may actually clear the ground away for a more fundamental and I would say more correct reform down the road. Just for example, in this business about removals, although I think that firing random federal employees just to get head counts down is not good policy, it was in fact very hard to remove officials that weren't doing their job. And I think that the executive authority of presidents in the future is going to be changed in ways that will give them more flexibility in designing the workforces that they want. Hopefully, a wise future president will keep the expertise that's necessary and get rid of bad performers in areas where they really deserve to be replaced by somebody else. But I think sometimes it does take a crisis like this, to really produce the political conditions by which you can actually preserve the basic capacity of your government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Scott, I'm going to ask you about younger people or people for whom it's not so long since degree. We talk about it. But just to follow up on Frank's point, I do think that one of the perhaps the mistakes of that early, and because I do believe that you had to level the playing field or level the ground.
Right.
But one of the mistakes might have been if you offer that you can leave with a very nice package. You've been in business. Any business knows that the people who will stay are the people who have no options, and the people who will leave are the people who have options. So actually, you end up with what we call regretted attrition instead of unregretted attrition. And I just think that might have been a different way of thinking about trying to clear out some of the underbrush, if you will, in the federal government. But Scott, I want to talk about one of your 5 points, which was that we are, if you look at the private sector, the federal government is very age balanced toward long service, and if you put that together with the need for technological revolution in the government. We all know that if you want to properly take pictures on your iPhone, find a 12-year-old. There's just something about the technology, the willingness to use it, the almost internalization of it that comes with people who have lived in that world. So how do you think about both technological reformation? I mean, when I got to the State Department, we had Wang computers, for instance. And there are still mainframes.
We still have mainframes in my department
that are running things. So how do you think about that and recruiting the younger talent? Because another casualty of the early stages of DOGE was that some of those probational employees were actually younger people who'd been brought in with, say, data science skills and then were on the cutting room floor. And I would just add, as somebody who preaches all the time to my students, oh, you should do public service, one has to be careful that you send a message that public service is both worth doing and respected. So talk a little bit from OPM, which is really the epicenter of hiring, how you think about those issues.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. Let me just make a quick comment on your 12-year-old comment. So there's a very well-known German physicist, Max Planck, who kind of was a physicist in the kind of late 1800s, and he wrote a paper, and it became the title came a little bit bastardized, but basically the thrust of his paper was technology advances one funeral at a time. And unfortunately, I think this is true, which is, there's no question that if we want the U.S. to be a technological leader, this age demographic problem clearly is a problem. So I think there's a couple things we have to do. One is, as I mentioned, is we have got to change the narrative. So the narrative to me that kind of lifetime employment is what is attractive about federal government, to me, is just the wrong narrative. I've had the pleasure of managing people for a long time now. My sense is there's basically two classes of employees basically that I've uncovered. One is there's the pure mercenary class. The government is never going to attract that individual. We are never going to solve a pay gap problem if your goal is just you want to make the maximum amount of money possible. So I just think we should stop trying to solve that problem. For all the problems in the GS pay scale, we're not going to solve that problem. And by the way, I don't think we should. But the good news is I think that's a relatively small class. My experience has been that most people take a job because they believe they're working for somebody who cares about their career development. They think they can learn. They're going to be surrounded by smart people. They're going to be challenged. They can have a career progression path that recognizes their performance. And they're motivated by the mission. They believe in the mission. That's what we need to sell young people on. And so one of the programs that we're working on is, as I mentioned, this idea that you need to decide to be a career civil servant, in my mind, also is just a very unfair thing for people to do. So we're rolling out a program post shutdown, hopefully, targeting basically 2 to 4 year employment opportunities for early career people in government. And the whole idea is exactly that, which is bring them in, help them be motivated by the mission, and then we're going to partner with the private sector. And my hope is the private sector then is going to hire these individuals into the private sector after their government work and demonstrate that the private sector actually values the work experience they had. And so if they are more on that mercenary side, they actually will, kind of make up from a compensation perspective. So I think we have to kind of do stuff like that. And then to your point, we've got to solve a lot of the other things I talked about, the performance management problems, things that kind of create an environment where a really smart individual can't be, kind of promoted through the organization. Yeah. So, since we're talking about Doge, as you recall, or you may recall, there was, I won't mention his name, but there was a very famous Doge engineer with a name that's inappropriate to say in this forum. But there was a quote from somebody at OMB actually saying, we would never have hired this individual because they didn't have a college degree and they had never worked before. They had no job tenure. And I wrote a blog post on it because it really bothered me. And I said, look, these types of things, basically, those create low performance cultures. So we've got to create a culture where if we have someone who actually has the skills to operate at a much higher level, even though they haven't gone to college or they don't have a minimum tenure, we ought to have a system that enables that, right? And right now, the system is just so tenure-based that it's really impossible. So I think it's a combination of all those things we have to do, Dr. Rice, to make this possible.
Well, and a couple of very important founders, if you just had a college degree requirement,
yes,
would not have made it,
yes,
which is something that the private sector can
exactly
understand. Yeah, I would also say, when I was secretary, one problem, and Philip will recognize this because he left the Foreign Service early. You can be in the Foreign Service, and for a couple of terms, or a couple of deployments, you end up stamping passports someplace.
Right.
So you also have to give younger people something interesting to do when they get to service. And Philip, I wanted to ask you, your COVID example is obviously very important, and I wish we would go back and study it. But the United States is a very complicated place. Yes, maybe Spain's complicated, Italy's certainly complicated, but not at the level that the United States is. You mentioned toward the end that we have the state and local authorities making decisions. So here in this area, Santa Clara County had extremely strict rules, including, for instance, that if I'm a golfer, you couldn't play golf, despite the fact that it was kind of God's gift to COVID, right? And they put out a list of sports that you could play, including single person volleyball. Now, I said that this was probably the kid who was not ever chosen in Choose Up at any point who wrote this. So that was Santa Clara County. And if you crossed San Francisco Creek into San Mateo County, you had very different rules. So the United States is just a very complicated place. We're 330 million people. We are fiercely independent about what we want to do. You have state and local. Do you think some of this is explicable by just how difficult. The federal government didn't have all of the levers. And if the answer to that is the federal government didn't have all of the levers, was there a mistake in not understanding the proper role of the federal government versus the role of states and localities?
Well, that's certainly right. Unlike other developed countries, we entered the COVID crisis with a public health system that represented the acme of understanding of the Grover Cleveland administration. It was really designed around the state-of-the-art of public health authority in 1890. And so all operational authority was at the state and local level, all. The CDC had no operational authority in America. Now, it turns out then there are these 3,000 entities. By the way, California is an interesting case. About half the states, it's at the state level. About half the states, it's delegated down to the counties. California, actually, people think California is a blue state, but from COVID analysis purposes, well, it depends on the county. It was principally run at the county level. So actually, you have all these red and blue counties. Santa Clara maybe being a bit on the blue side. Now then what's happening is, since the 3,000 counties all themselves don't know what to do, they're then looking for advice. So they're looking to the CDC to give them advice. So on this business of, then the CDC has these biologists who actually themselves don't know how to run programs. And then there are other people in Washington who are supposed to do, quote, there was an Assistant Secretary of Health for, quote, preparation and readiness. ASPR was the acronym in the business. And then there were big conflicts of authority over what the ASPR could do and what the CDC could do, though neither of them had operational authority, and Washington also had a lot of the money. So what then happens is the biologists look at this with their TB models and give the kind of health guidance that tries to keep Condi from playing golf.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And meanwhile, there are occupational health folks, other elites, who are saying, well, that's crazy. We know a lot about dangers of aerosol exposures and so forth. So we've studied that in these other environments, but those elites didn't have the it's in at CDC in Atlanta. So now it's not so much a story of elites versus the common sense of the masses. This is actually a story of the sociology of American elites, which when you live in this world, these are the most familiar stories of all. So then you do have, it's complicated in that way, but if you're trying to think about, okay, how do we prepare for national emergencies? An aspect of collective civilian competence is to prepare and train your people. Some of that is, you allocate authorities and then you train people in order to choreograph the things they'll need to choreograph in emergency. One of the interesting things about Florida, by the way, is Florida was very good at certain aspects of the crisis because Florida, like actually a lot of the Texas Gulf Coast, had a ton of experience with emergencies. Yeah. So actually usually it's an Office of Emergency Management at the state and even down at the county and local level, who are often really quite good and have very capable people. And then so in certain aspects of the crisis, if you could tap that expertise and use those people effectively, they would function very well. So we have all these strengths and weaknesses. And so in a sense, the competence part is putting it all together in a country that, unlike Spain and Italy, had vastly more money, vastly better hospitals, way more doctors, all these resources. And so when you have all the resources and the science and you apply it so much less effectively, that's the variable we're trying to get at here.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to, go ahead, Frank.
Can I just
of course.
make so Condi, you're right that this is a very complicated country. Yeah. All the ethnic, regional, geographical diversity other countries don't have, but we make government unnecessarily complicated, yeah. Right? So David Chu is giving these examples of, why does the city of San Francisco, need like 180 oversight commissions? And the state of California is a really great case of this. 58 counties, something like 4,500 independent commissions. My colleague Mike Bennon has been talking about this short 4.5-mile section of freeway that was supposed to have been built in the late 60s to connect the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles to the main freeway system. It's been blocked by the city of South Pasadena for the last 70 years or 50 years, you know? And so when you combine rules that empower, you know, these very small units with veto power, you get, you know,
Get what you get.
stagnation.
Yes.
Often done for these progressive reasons, interestingly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn to the audience. I just want to say one thing. One time that we actually did get a lot of this right was after 9/11. Because you can, I know TSA is not great, but when you think about being able to reopen airports within a relatively short period of time, given what we knew about terrorism, new rules about what you could and could not take on a plane. And by the way, we didn't just get it in the United States, we actually internationalized it very quickly. So that if you go to an airport in Madrid or in Abu Dhabi or in London or in the United States, it pretty much looks the same from the point of view of international travel. And it might be interesting in contrast to the COVID, where we really didn't have much internationalization, to understand better how that got done pretty quickly. By the way, with most states very quickly creating offices of Homeland Security, which they did not have on the day of 9/11. So that might be a little bit of a counterexample to look at. Yes, so a few questions from the audience. Yes.
I'm Robert. I'm a sophomore at Stanford studying history. I wanted to address a question to Mr. Cooper, which is basically, I think you talk about the mercenary class as this kind of minority, that's a minority problem. It's not really reflective of the federal government. But I want to push back on that a little bit, just because, for example, the Department of Justice, like the incentive structure for lawyers to go into like private law versus the Department of Justice as assistant attorney generals is completely backward. And so I think that there is a very big problem that you're missing, which is that we've lost our virtues, I think, within the federal service. And so I wanted to introduce a quote that Professor Kennedy brought up yesterday, which is interaction between William Allen White and his first meeting with Theodore Roosevelt. I'd never known such a man as he, and shall never again. He poured into my heart such visions, such ideals, such hopes, such a new attitude towards life and patriotism and the meaning of things as I had never dreamed men had. How can we restore that like virtue and that honor in our, employment?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, we need people like you to come help us do that. So, yeah, look, I totally agree with you, which is, I absolutely agree that that is the best pitch in the world, right? The best pitch in the world is this is an honorable place to be. You can solve great problems. I 100% agree. And look, we're living in a challenging time where we have some, I would say, brand building to do for sure in that area. So number one, I don't disagree with you at all. I think your AUSA example is a great example, which is. You're exactly right, which is, for people who, didn't go to law school, if you go to law school, a really prestigious job to get out of law school is to go to, be an assistant U.S. attorney. And obviously you get paid, very little compared to what you could make in the private sector. But what you see, at least in my mind, I think what works there is the reason that works is because you actually get real experience that you couldn't get in the private sector. And then the private sector has demonstrated they value that experience by then being willing to hire AUSAs into very prestigious roles in private law firms for people who decide they want to do that. That to me is what we need. We need to demonstrate, and that's why I think these more temporary assignments make more sense, which is we need to demonstrate you can do great work, that actually the problems you're solving are real problems, and that those problems, to the extent you want to go to the private sector, are valued by the private sector in that they will be willing to ultimately compensate you for it. So that's how I think we tap into that mercenary class. What I was trying to articulate, maybe not very, very well, is people spend a lot of time debating, do we need to change the pay scales in government? In my mind, we're never going to get there. Nobody's going to vote for that anyways. And I don't think that's the problem. But I think if we can dispel this myth that you are making a career decision and that the private sector will value the experience you have, I think you can capture both the mercenary and the missionary side of the workforce.
Yes. I'm going to go here and then here. Yes.
Dr. Fukuyama, you mentioned the legal and other issues of California high-speed rail. Brightline is building a line from Las Vegas to Los Angeles and seems to have avoided many of those legal and other issues. could you explain perhaps the difference between those two and why Brightline is able to build much faster and less expensive and profitable and so on?
Well, the guy sitting right behind you can probably answer that question better, but I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that, for example, the two states that are the biggest producers of alternative energy are two deep red states, Texas and Oklahoma. And the reason that they produce so much alternative energy is not ideological, it's that they've got a much simpler permitting process than California does. And so I do think that, certain states, especially blue states, add this extra regulatory burden that makes it very difficult to do things like build high-speed rail. I mean, among other things, one of the big problems in California with high-speed rail is just where the track's going to go, because the most direct route from San Francisco to Los Angeles was derailed by the fact that, the representative from Palmdale thought it ought to swing out through that valley before it went up north. And you've just got kind of macro political problems like that within the state of California itself that I think have made it very difficult to come to an agreement on, funding and then building the thing.
Yeah. And meanwhile, it's getting more and more expensive and further and further out. And yes, right here, yes.
My name is Ross. I am a senior here studying history and mathematics. I have a question for you, Dr. Zelikow. When you were talking about the conflicts within the government regarding COVID management, it seems that you are referring to a problem that repeats many times in history, which is you have a government with duplicitous structures that all have overlapping authorities, but none of them really has authority to run the operations. How does this happen? How does this come to be historically? When does this happen, and how do you see us can possibly get out of it?
Oh, well, and Frank has done a lot of work on this too, is basically constituent groups create the authorities they want. Different kinds of constituent groups, and usually working through Congress to create particular bastions of authority so that you'll then have rival and overlapping authorities. So, for example, there was the Center for Disease Control was just supposed to be basically a group of biologists who were supposed to provide scientific advice to public health authorities. It didn't really have an operational programmatic role, but it wanted to build itself up and bulk itself up into being a public health authority. Meanwhile, there's Tony Fauci over at the National Institutes of Health, who, by the way, doesn't regard himself as I talked to Fauci, and doesn't regard himself as an epidemiologist, and was highly critical of the CDC. Then over at the HHS, there was the notion we need someone running preparation and readiness for a possible pandemic. So they built up that office, but that office didn't have operational authority either, and was vying for supremacy with other entities inside the Health and Human Services Department. So how this arises is actually not such a hard question, because different groups create the authorities they want. The authorities grow over time. They overlap and challenge each other. The hard part then is, okay, if I actually want to get stuff done, I have to figure out a way of how I reconcile these authorities. And as one of our experts put it during the day today, how do we metabolize these conflicts? So I don't think you get to the world in which we magnificently design the DNA from the start so that it's all perfectly clear from the get-go and it never evolves in ways that clash. So you have to manage the clashes. And the test, in a way, and it becomes another test of competence. You manage the clashes if you think about what is it that we want to do, and then you work through the choreographies of many players that have to come together to do those things. If you really don't know what it is you want to do, and you don't map out the choreography, then you essentially move into a passive position where the cacophony of voices will just overwhelm the conversation.
Yeah, I also think, just from my own experience, one of the issues is when it's a really big crisis, the White House wants to control, because the president does not want it out of his control. And the White House is not, whether it's the National Security Council, National Economic Council, whatever it is, does not have the operational capacity to do it. And so you then end up getting a lot of confusion from the political level. We had in the Bush administration 2 crises, pandemic-like crises, very small, but avian flu, which was breaking out in China. Same thing, we did not know what was going on. We didn't understand what was happening. And then over Christmas, a couple of years later, the mad cow disease. The president right away said, Secretary of Agriculture is going to handle these. And so it was a small enough crisis that actually was able to be contained within the Secretary of Agriculture, drawing on others as she needed it. But the minute it becomes a White House task force, look out. Because now it becomes a kind of political, almost a little bit political theater, because the president who's elected to do this believes that he has to have control of it, and the White House is just not operationally capable. So I think another thing that happens in some of these crises is that it's one of the reasons, by the way, that President Bush decided right away to have a Homeland Security Council, first headed by a governor, by Tom Ridge, and then a Homeland Security Department was to get it out of the White House. And I think sometimes the White House takes things into it that it shouldn't. Yeah. One more question all the way in the back. Yes.
Yes. Hi, Philip Howard. This is a question for Mr. Cooper. I've written a lot about the history of the civil service system and agree with you that the current system is broken.
Yes.
And my question for you is, do you see a tension between the idea of a merit system and making federal employees at-will employees?
Speaking for myself personally, I do not actually. Look, I think at-will systems are incredibly powerful systems, and I think, look, the private sector has demonstrated that very clearly, and I don't think there's any lack of merit principles that dominate the private sector. My understanding, and you would know better than I, obviously, is, look, we worry about, a bastardization of those merit principles, right, and do things that look like, do they look like political justifications, kind of cloaking themselves as merit justifications. But, just to put it on the table, from my perspective, look, the more federal employees that we could make at will or as close to possible as at will, I personally think that would lead to a much, much better system from both a merit perspective, from performance management, and from an ability to actually accomplish objectives. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for an excellent discussion. Thank you for joining and for your attention. And to our students here, I hope you've heard a good argument for perhaps doing government service at some point, if not at the federal level, maybe at the state and local level. Thanks a lot for being part of it.